Hi, I'm Jeffrey Smith from the Institute for Responsible Technology, and this is Neil Levin, and where are you from?
I'm from Chicago, Illinois.
And which company?
I'm with Now Products.
Okay, so Now Products has been a non-GMO advocate for longer than I have. When I first got involved, the Now logo was a sponsor for Craig Winter's campaign for labeling, etc. I met your founder, etc. We've given lectures here. And when the non-GMO project started in a big way, I approached you in 2007 at the Expo West in Anaheim, and I said, the non-GMO project is going great guns on food, but there's no one on the board that's associated with supplements. And you're an expert at supplements, and you're dedicated to trying to be as non-GMO as possible. Why don't you form a supplement committee and be a member so that you can figure out how to make supplements non-GMO according to a standard? And so the background that Neil has and that we have goes way back in terms of the beginning of setting a standard for non-GMO, and you've been working with the non-GMO project and working with other companies, etc. So the purpose of this conversation is really, as a consumer, if you're looking for non-GMO supplements, what do you look for? And not just the non-GMO label, but there are certain supplements that are difficult to make in non-GMO categories. And so why don't you first describe the non-GMO challenge as a supplement, as a product formulator, as a company, etc., to give the broad perspective, and then we'll start talking about some specifics for people.
Yeah, well, you're right, Jeffrey. I started working with the non-GMO project on their supplement committee in 2007, and was on their technical advisory board for a time while we had that. And
let me just say, I'm not with the non-GMO project. When I approached Neil, I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the non-GMO project, but once I suggested it, then you took off. Okay.
Right. So I was happy to work with them. There was a focus, as you mentioned, on foods. And what falls through the cracks are a lot of these highly processed ingredients that are used to make supplements. The sugars and starches, for example, lecithin and vitamin E and things like that, that they might be used in a natural flavoring, as, say, lecithin would be used as an emulsifier, vitamin E might be used as a preservative, for example. Starches are used in many ingredients as a stabilizer, as a substrate, as a standardizer. So let's say you're growing something in fermentation.
Okay, so first of all, before we jump into fermentation, I'm going to slow you down because I know some things that people watching may not know. What creates vitamin E and lecithin? Typically, what's the starting source?
The common sources are soybeans,
All right.
soybean oil.
So 93% of the soybeans in the United States are genetically engineered, Roundup ready, sprayed with Roundup. And in order to create the soy lecithin or the vitamin E, there's a processing plant that goes through all sorts of extractions and whatnot, and then you end up with some kind of sludge or something at the end of that, which then extracts both the vitamin E and the lecithin?
Right. You press the oil out of the soybeans, and then the oil is distilled and fractionated so that you get different things out of it. Vitamin E is naturally in soybeans, so they're extracting that with one technique. Lecithin is naturally in the soybean oil as well, so there's another technique to pull that out.
So you basically, in order to have a non-GMO soybean-based lecithin or vitamin E, you need the whole plant to be non-GMO, using non-GMO soybeans continuously, or at least for a batch process. In other words, you bring in non-GMO soybeans, you run it through the batch for a while so everything's pure non-GMO, and then you can call the output non-GMO. So it's a big deal. For a long time it was very difficult. Well, I may ask you, how difficult was it in the beginning to get non-GMO vitamin E and non-GMO soy lecithin?
Well, about 20 years ago we started seeing the GMO crops escalating and starting to, this is my term, contaminate the supply, where everything that was non-GMO before, and everything was non-GMO before, all of a sudden there's these GMO derived things hitting the market and going into the same production. There's not that many producers of vitamin E in the world. There's not that many producers of lecithin in the world. You know, probably fewer than a dozen of each. So you're talking about these very large supply streams that they're collecting from a lot of farms, and if there's not a separate track, then you don't have identity preserved non-GMO sourcing. And one alternative is to test the crop before it's processed, even though you haven't tested at the farm level. That's one of the challenges. That's easier than documenting all the way back every producer and supplier and transporter all the way back to the farm.
Yeah, most people don't have any idea when they think of something, oh, just make it non-GMO. Once you get into this concept of a factory or a processing plant that receives grain from various elevators. The elevators receive grain from various farms. You may talk about hundreds of sources that have to be non-GMO. And one person's non-GMO, maybe another person's contaminated. And so they bring these trucks in, and they're waiting there for this strip test. So they have to take a scoop out, put it in a blender. In about 30 minutes, you get a little strip test and see it's a yes or no. And so you don't exactly know how much of it is contaminated if it's a yes. And if it's clean, well, did you scoop in one part of the truck and not the other? So there's all sorts of technical aspects.
Right. But
essentially, you're ideally looking for a non-GMO processing plant, which was few and far between as soon as GMOs started coming on the market, because everyone just accepted the same farmers' trucks and they weren't paying so much attention in the beginning.
Right, because it kind of snuck up on them. They weren't even aware that something had changed in what the farmers were doing. Farmers have a lot of options. And the fact that so many of them were jumping on this bandwagon and believing the hype that this is the wave of the future and this is what they need to do to be successful, and being trained that way, literally, meant that the farmers started switching en masse, and all of a sudden the supply changed. So we didn't change. We still wanted to buy the same natural products we already had, but it took a few years, really, until we started being able to reliably source non-GMO, for example, soy protein, or some of the things that were the most obvious and the most likely to contain GMOs. But here it is 20 years later, and we're still looking at ingredients like vitamin E and lecithin and starches. Cornstarch would be another example.
So 20 years later, there's been a lot of effort by your company and others to be as non-GMO as possible, but sometimes it's just not possible. So let's start with I'm going to ask in just a moment, what are the products that you simply cannot deliver in a non-GMO production process? But when we talk about the production process, I cut you off a moment ago. You're talking about growing something in fermentation. I don't know if most people realize the fermentation vat growing process to produce some of these ingredients that are used for the supplements. Explain that, explain the GMO risk there, and then we'll start naming the supplements which are hard to get or impossible to get as non-GMO, and which ones you have some GMO and some non-GMO, so the customers have a choice, and some that are never GMO. Okay.
Right. So with fermentation, it's basically a vat with some kind of microbe in there. It's typically bacteria, sometimes yeast. And there's an art, there's a craft, there's a skill involved in tweaking that so that you have the right microorganism, the right environment, the temperature, humidity, amount of oxygen, all those things, and the right feeds to tweak it so that that particular organism is going to make one particular nutrient or one particular enzyme or one particular substance in a great enough amount to be commercially successful, and that they can separate that out. So that's how they're growing a lot of the enzymes.
So these are like bacteria farms. You know, you have a bunch of cows and they produce milk, and then you export the milk. So a lot of cows, you come and milk them. Here it's like, I say, get along, bacteria. It's like, herding up the bacteria. Yeah. You bring them in, you round them up, and you create an environment for them to produce what you're looking for. So what are the common byproducts of the fermentation process that end up in bottles?
Common things would be enzymes, amino acid, some of the vitamins, For example, vitamin B12 is made by fermentation only. That's the only source on Earth. You can't really synthesize it.
Okay.
So it has to be produced in a vat. And so you end up with these substances that are often in variable strength forms and then are standardized with starches. And many of the starches are cornstarch or things that might, again, have a GMO origin.
So when you have a cornstarch, it's clear you've taken corn, you fractionated it, you create the starch, you put it in. You can do non-GMO corn as well. But what about bacteria that's genetically engineered to produce the outcome? In other words, this synthetic biology. I'll give you a little taste of it. It's not necessarily predictable. It's not necessarily safe. It's turning the bacteria into a factory to produce an output. And it could be safe, and it could be producing something that's exactly the same as the natural, or it might be have impurities, or it might have a different structure. So it introduces risk when you introduce the genetically modified piece into it. And we could talk about the tryptophan supplement that was created through fermentation that created impurities that killed people in the 1980s, or the 1990s as well. So which bacteria are genetically engineered by the supplement industry to produce these enzymes and vitamins and amino acids?
Well, there's typically not that much being used in our industry today because people have been asking about the types of organisms they're using and trying to get non-GMO certifications or documentation on that for a long time. But there are a few things still, like there are some trademark ingredients, some amino acids, for example, that are trademarked and well known, and they're using a genetically modified organism to generate that. So, as you mentioned before, they're tweaking with genetic modification an enzyme or a bacteria that produces this amino acid better than the natural form of that bacteria. This is fairly unusual today, though. I mean, that's not as common as it used to be.
So most of the microbes that are used in production for supplements are natural.
Yeah, we're being given documentations, an assurance, more or less, rather than straight, it's not highly documented, but at least it's a promise that it's non-GMO. And just like you will see on milk cartons, our farmers pledge not to use these hormones. They're saying that they are pledging that they have not used these GMO organisms in the production.
Now, when you're growing cows, the problem is you're feeding the cows often genetically modified corn and soy. Sometimes they'll just eat the grass.
Right.
But you can feed the cows the genetically modified feed, and then that could change the milk and the meat. What do you feed the fermentation vats? Anything that might be genetically engineered?
Quite commonly, they're using wheat in some things, which is not genetically engineered typically these days.
Yeah.
But corn and soybeans would be common fermentation foods. So we're also trying to get assurances, and we have that from most of our suppliers now, that they're not using GMO versions of these sugars and starches, or even protein sources in some cases, to feed that organism, typically a bacteria, in the fermentation. So on most products we have some assurance. It's probably not enough for the non-GMO project in many cases to give their assurance, but we have a non-GMO assurance process. And we have looked at over 900 products that have gone through our GMO assurance process.
900?
Over 900 products.
Looking at the GMO sourcing?
Looking at the sourcing of each ingredient.
Wow.
And over 900 products. It was something like 913 a couple weeks ago.
Did you have to hire someone to do that?
We have a whole staff working on this, yes.
I tell you, I talked to some companies who I've recommended that they go to the non-GMO project, and some are like, oh, no problem. We have no at-risk ingredients, and we pass through flying colors. Others like, we hired someone full-time, or we hired a staff full-time for over a year just to go through the process. So what happens is you pass it down to your supplier. Your supplier may have other suppliers. If you're feeding soy into their vats, then the soy comes from possibly an elevator with many other suppliers, and it quickly scrambles out of control if you haven't been starting with the controlled process in the beginning. So that's why in some cases we've heard that some very major companies are switching to non-GMO, and they're planning to do it over 5 years. These are major food companies, because it's not just like flipping a switch. So in a moment, we're going to come back with part 2 and talk about which products could be GMO and which products could be non-GMO, so that it'd be easier for you as a consumer to choose. So we have the bacteria itself, which might be genetically engineered, but not so much. We have what's feeding the bacteria, which might be genetically engineered. We have the additional stabilizers, etc., which might be genetically engineered. In some cases, the entire product is derived, like vitamin E or vitamin C, from a GMO. So there's a lot of ways that GMOs can enter the picture for supplements. So are there certain supplements that you simply cannot get in the non-GMO form right now?
Right, or maybe a more accurate way to put it is we don't have documentation that it's non-GMO. We do have documentation that it's PCR negative, that it tests negative for GMOs in the finished product, but of course that's so processed that you wouldn't expect to see GMOs in there
let
anyway.
me explain. I used to work at a GMO detection laboratory as the VP of Marketing Communications, and we used PCR, which is a laboratory technique to amplify or multiply the DNA of a product millions and millions of times, and then evaluate its presence and relative size or amount. But if you have no DNA in the final product, you're not going to be able to amplify it or multiply it. So if you're using highly refined oils, you won't find DNA in the highly refined oils. You won't find DNA in vitamin C. So a lot of these supplements are more chemicals. They don't have the DNA. So not finding it in the final product doesn't mean it's non-GMO. Now some companies, unscrupulous companies, will say that their product is non-GMO because there's no detection in the final product. So there's a vitamin C company that uses GMO corn, produces a vitamin C, and says, we haven't found any GMOs in the final product. And it's like I've told them, that's deceptive marketing. You better change that. And I haven't checked to see if they've changed it. If they haven't, I'll let you know the name of the company and the details. So talk about, you can't find it in the final PCR, but there's no documentation. And why is that?
They just don't track it. The document trail ends at a certain point in terms of these details, and to extend that beyond to each supplier, each middleman, all the way back to the farm is an extensive process that sometimes takes years. So that's one of the reasons it's taken so long to get all this documented and to show that they're non-GMO, is because we're looking at materials that are going through a lot of hands and a lot of processing, and they're tracking that at the end. So yes, we have gotten statements from some suppliers saying we are non-GMO because it's PCR negative, and we say no, it's not non-GMO, it's GMO free in the final product, but we still need to know where it's from. One of the challenges, like vitamin C you mentioned, we have some suppliers that have IP, identity preserved documentation, all the way back to the farm that it's non-GMO. Other ones test the corn before it's processed into vitamin C, while it still has DNA, and it comes out PCR negative there, and then they process it, so we know it's from non-GMO corn. They still don't have that documentation all the way back to the farm level, but at least we have some assurance that they're making it from a non-GMO source, which is, that's one of the distinctions between our non-GMO assurance process and, say, the non-GMO project. They want to go all the way back to the farm, and if that doesn't exist, we're happy for now to say, okay, we know the corn is tested and it's free of GMOs, it's from a non-GMO source. Hopefully we'll be able to get them to extend that documentation back through the supply chain over time.
So you don't know of any particular supplement on the market that you sell as Now Foods or others that is simply always GMO?
Well, there is one trademark ingredient, amino acid, we're told that they're using a GMO organism to produce it, but it's a pure amino acid that they end up with, and it's not containing GMOs in the final product.
So in other words, they've changed the genetics of the microbe, the bacteria or the yeast,
Right.
to produce the amino acid, so it's genetically engineered. And then they've said, look at our amino acid, and you can't use it because it's patented, et cetera, trademarked. So now I can tell you about tryptophan, which was created from genetically engineered bacteria in the same way we just described.
Yeah.
And the process almost certainly created contaminants, which caused about 100 people to die and 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick, and many became permanently disabled. And it was Showa Denko KK, a Japanese company that was producing it. And there was a cover-up of the genetic engineered origins. And I write about this in my book, Seeds of Deception, and in a smaller way in my book, Genetic Roulette. And if you go to responsibletechnology.org, you can read the evidence of William Christ, who did an investigation over many years, the most in-depth investigation with some of his colleagues, that reveal the cover-up and the genetic engineering origins of this dangerous epidemic. If they had acknowledged that it was the genetic engineering that caused this epidemic, then it would have stopped GMOs in their tracks. So it was very important for the biotech industry to pretend that GMOs were not part of it, and they just said, look the other way, nothing to see here. And even when the FDA gave a talk to Congress about the epidemic, they ignored the fact that the only company whose tryptophan caused this disease was genetically engineering the bacteria. Instead, they said, it's just tryptophan in general. We've been using it for years, but somehow now we know it's unsafe, even though it's only this company's genetically engineered bacteria that created the unsafe version. We're just going to take all tryptophan off the market. And then they introduced Prozac, which was the competitor to tryptophan, and it really was a boost for Prozac. Anyway, that's not the discussion we're making now. That's a side effect, a side event. So there's this one trademark. Now, what are some of the ones that people have to be careful about? Is it basically all supplements could be GMO or non-GMO because there could be cornstarch and everything? Or are there certain named ones, like you already named vitamin C, vitamin A, E, and soy lecithin? What are the other ones that people have to be concerned about if they're trying to get non-GMO?
Well, those are so processed that really they're not a big cause of concern in the final product. Even if they were derived from GMOs, they're isolated. So you have a pure vitamin E. It's pharmaceutical grade. It's as pure as can be tested in terms of nothing else in there. One of the problems that probably occurred with something like the tryptophan, where they had a GMO organism and they weren't tracking what it was and what it was doing, is probably over several batches it mutated and started producing a large amount of toxin that nobody was looking for.
See, it was interesting with the tryptophan. It was 98.5% pure. It was U.S. pharmaceutical grade pure. And the amount of contaminants, there were 5 or 6 contaminants that ranged between 0.1% and 0.01% of the final product. So we're talking about tiny levels.
Yes.
And it was rejected by, I think, Germany at one point. And if you look at the data that was collected by William Christ, they found some contaminants. There was discussion of it. But no one was relating it to any disease or disorder. And sometimes the fermentation process will give you contaminants that you just sort of pass along with the others. So when you say, so here's an interesting point. If something is 100% pure with absolutely zero contaminants, which would be zero detectable contaminants based on the ability of the instrument to detect, is it as safe as its non-GMO counterpart? And there is one way, and this is theoretical, and I don't know if it applies to vitamin E. It's above my pay grade, but you have chemistry, so you can tell me.
Yeah.
If the structure is different, it could still be, there's the proteins that might have a different structure but still called the same name. The stereo isomers, et cetera, the changing structure, it's possible that that's shifted, and if it's shifted, it has a completely different impact on an organism, potentially.
Right.
So is it possible if you use GMO versus non-GMO as the basis, and you bring it down to the pure vitamin E, is it possible that the structure of the molecule might be different?
No, it would be the same molecule in this case.
Exact same structure.
Or the amino acid.
Exact same structure.
Yes, the actual amino would be the same.
And how it's folded into a protein?
Right.
Okay, because in some cases, and I write about this in Genetic Roulette, there's a right-handed versus a left-handed. There's a change in the structure that can occur as a result of the process of genetic engineering.
Yeah, for an amino acid, the reversal would make it a synthetic amino acid. It would be easily detectable by optical rotation testing.
There you go, optical rotation. You look at it,
Yeah.
you roll your eyes, and you can tell. All right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's not the concern. Really, it's more of an environmental concern or a sourcing concern at that point, rather than that you're going to be eating GMOs.
So I'm going to withhold judgment. I appreciate it, and it's certainly a valid evaluation of risk. Like I wrote about genetically modified sugar, and I said created from sugar beets, it's like 99.x% pure. And I said, well, what about the other part, because about the tryptophan? And I don't know if the molecular structure of the sugar is different if it's created from GMO versus non-GMO, and I'd like to know. But when I wrote about it, I was more focusing on the impurities, and also obviously the sugar beets are sprayed with Roundup because it's Roundup ready, and sugar beet pulp is used to feed racehorses that are very expensive racehorses, and there was a correlation between the introduction of that and breaking down of racehorses, which we haven't investigated because we didn't have the staff, etc. Anyway, another side event. Go ahead. So,
So, I mean, there's another ingredient that is a phytosome. It's a phosphatidylcholine, a compound taken from lecithin. So they take soybeans and they extract the oil, and then they distill out the lecithin, and then they distill out a fraction of the lecithin called phosphatidylcholine, which is used in a lot of products, or phosphatidylserine. And for example, we have a trademark ingredient from a company in Europe, Germany, that normally uses European soybeans that are non-GMO, but occasionally they buy a batch from the United States, which of course is probably GMO. And they're not separating them. And we're telling them, that's stupid, you should be separating them and tracking them and advertising it as non-GMO, because more and more companies are going to follow the demands of their consumers. Because we're getting several requests for GMO identification on products that don't have it on the label every day. Consumers are contacting us. I want to know if this product I'm taking has GMOs, and we're looking up the ingredients where we don't have it already tracked, like those 913 products so far, and saying, well, as far as we could tell, there's nothing in there that poses a risk. It hasn't gone through our full process yet.
Right.
Or this contains a soybean derivative that has not been documented yet. So we're not sure if it's GMO or not. So there's a few instances where that happens. In most cases, we can assure them that we've already gone through the process and it's no risk of GMO.
And I agree that German processor, or the processor that was creating the fractionation of the soy lecithin, was stupid. Because at this point, there's no food company in the world that is unaware of the GMO issue, if they're of any size.
Yeah.
And to realize that they may be mixing GMO on an occasional batch, which is ruining the ability of all their marketers to use the word non-GMO, is stupid. I remember I was in South Africa many years ago, over 10 years ago, and they were feeding animals GMOs and then sending them to Europe. And I said to their big financial paper in an interview, it's really stupid. You have so much non-GMO feed. You have all these companies in Europe that have committed to use animals that are not fed GMOs. You're throwing away that market simply by contaminating your feed. And so the government actually changed its policy after that, fortunately, and stopped using importing GMO feed for the stuff. But I don't know what the situation is now. That was a long time ago. Anything else you want to say? This is consumers who buy supplements who want to know, are my supplements GMO or non-GMO? Guide them.
Well, as you know, Jeffrey, our company is committed to non-GMO. We believe GMO products are not natural, or we're a natural products company. Mm-hmm. So we have devoted a lot of resources over years to try to track and document and lean on our suppliers to get more documentation where it doesn't exist, and switching the suppliers in some cases to try to assure that we're getting only non-GMO products. I can tell you right now that anything we buy now as an ingredient that has a potential of being GMO sourced would be free of GMOs. It would be so highly processed you could test it all day and there's no GMOs in there.
But there still could be GMOs in the inputs.
In the inputs on a few items, and it's typically these highly processed things. You know, natural flavors, for example, they're going to typically use a lecithin or something like that as an emulsifier, as something to hold it together. They're typically going to use a starch as a base to give it some substance. And sometimes they'll have vitamin E, for example, as a preservative. And these are corn and soybean inputs typically. You know, in some cases they'll use tapioca or some other source, or sunflower source of them, but that's just coming in now. That's not universal. Right. So most of the natural flavors we've been able to get certified non-GMO sourcing.
Which means
that's been a big issue.
And so, you know, I choose non-GMO.
Right.
Even if it's highly refined, I'd rather not take the risk. I know a great deal about the risk. I certainly, and I've said this in my writings, that the more processed the GMO is, the less risk there is. We don't know if they eliminate the risk altogether. It's a technical thing, and it depends on the detailed chemistry to see if it's exactly the same. So the more refined, it's very interesting. People say, I don't want to eat refined or processed foods. In this case, when you process GMOs, they become less dangerous. Whereas if you eat corn on the cob, that's Monsanto's Bt toxin and Roundup Ready, that's probably the most dangerous because it's hardly processed. You can eat it even raw, and you get the Bt toxin, the Roundup, and the changed genetic structure of the corn all at once. And the Roundup Ready corn, for example, has high levels of cadaverine and putrescine, which not only are responsible for the foul odor of rotting dead bodies, but they can enhance histamine response, so it can increase allergic reactions, and they can also potentially create increased cancer risk. So there you go. So it's not processed, and it's more risky. Highly processed, less risky, possibly no risk, but I'm not going to say that because I don't know if we can at this point, and I know you're more confident than I am for sure. So when I was asking the question about the consumers, I mean, you're talking about Now Foods, which is yours,
right?
But I'm talking about in general. If they go to the supplement aisle and they pick it up, what are the ones that they have to be particularly careful about that are almost always sourced from a GMO origin?
Well, I would certainly look at things that contain soy protein. And is that protein always say non-GMO on the label? And you know, that's something even we who are so used to doing this, I'm proofing labels this week that have a soy component, and I'm saying, how come it doesn't say non-GMO on the label when I'm proofing? Is this a non-GMO, and can we add this to the label? And maybe the soy derivative is vitamin E or something innocuous like that. But still, we want to be able to know that we've gone through that assurance process and put it on the label, just like we put allergens on the label. And people can't track their allergies and what they're reactive to if you don't put allergens on the label. Nobody knows on GMOs, because it's not labeled, if they're reacting to them or not. Right. So if we can put it on the label that it's non-GMO, at least they know that this is not going to be that type of risk factor for them.
Okay. So vitamin C derived from corn, unless it says otherwise, could be GMO corn?
Yeah, but almost all the vitamin C is from China, and typically a lot of it is IP, identity preserved, non-GMO sourcing. The rest of it is tested before it's processed as non-GMO. So we're pretty assured that the vitamin C is all coming from non-GMO sourcing.
So it's interesting because when I was in China, I've been there 3 times, I interviewed some people, and the government was claiming that certain corn was not genetically engineered, and yet the name of the corn you could find in the literature as coming from a genetically engineered source. And it was highly prevalent in a particular region where they ended up with high levels of birth defects, lower levels of fertility among pigs. This is birth defects and lower levels of fertility among pigs. And certain field mice or rat, I forget at this point, was essentially wiped out, or their prevalence disappeared. And an investigator, I interviewed him in China, was believing that it was genetically engineered corn. And in that interview, he pointed out that the government was saying it's non-GMO, but the corn number you could find was GMO. So if you say that it's been tested before the input, I feel better about it. If you say that they just claim that it's non-GMO, I'm a little nervous.
Well, there's an identity preservation. There's a certification all the way back to the farm.
Okay.
Or
Good.
it's been tested before it's processed. So we're pretty comfortable with that.
Okay, good, good,
Yeah.
good. All right. Anything else you want to add?
Just that we have a lot of products. We have about 1,500 products, and going through thousands of ingredients from tens of thousands of potential suppliers is a long, tedious process. It's something that takes a lot of energy, a lot of labor, a lot of documentation, a lot of discussion, and a lot of prodding suppliers to give us information. A lot of the things they do, like fermentation, it's a trade secret. They don't want to tell you what they're doing. Getting that information is difficult in many cases. You know, that's what differentiates them from their competitors in their minds. So they don't understand how important this is to consumers. We do.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So many hours on that. If you add them all up, it's probably more than one person's lifetime. Someone sacrificed their life collectively so that you can have non-GMO foods and supplements. Well, thank you, Neil. I want to thank Now Foods for your 2 decades plus support of the non-GMO movement and your commitment to non-GMO. And I had a Facebook Live with your CEO, Jim, at Expo earlier this year, where I said to people, even if this company is non-GMO, and sometimes they have a product that contains GMOs because they can't source it all the way back, so don't be angry at companies that may not be able to satisfy all your non-GMO demands. Just choose the ones that you know to be safe and the ones that meet your criteria, and have some patience for the 1,500 products with thousands of suppliers and the decades of man hours and women hours that are going to take to source it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay. Safe eating.